Education Select Committee say that using terms such as white privilege may be contributing to the neglect of white working class pupils.
A report by the committee has found that disadvantaged white children continue to be let down by what they say is muddled policy thinking and a lack of recognition about the scale of educational underachievement by disadvantaged white children.
Currently, is the definitions, white pupils on free school meals leave school with lower GCSE attainment than any other minority group, I think with the exception of Roma kids and Irish traveller kids. The chairman of the committee, the Conservative MP Robert Halfon, has urged the Department for Education to, quote, desperately address the matter to resolve decades of neglect.
We're glad to be joined now by the former Education Secretary, Justine Greening. Good morning, Justine.
Morning.
What do you make of this report, this 80-page report about white working class underachievement? And we spoke to Tom Hunt earlier about the fact that this white privilege aspect is only a small part of this report, and you know, of course, that's true. But isn't it the case that terms like this are not helpful when we know that one of the most disadvantaged groups in the country educationally are white working class pupils?
I think the report sets out something that we've known for some time, which is that white working class children and young people are not doing as well in our education system as other groups in our society, and that's completely unacceptable. I think the reality is in terms of how you fix it, because frankly, we've had lots of these reports over the years, and I think we're at the stage now where we really need to see much more action taken to address the underlying issues. How you address those underlying issues is recognising that it is complicated. There are more than just one or two things. And one of the things that I did when I was Secretary of State for Education that is having an impact on precisely this sort of challenge for white working class kids was a policy called opportunity areas, where we recognise that improving education outcomes isn't just about what happens with teachers and pupils in schools. It's also about what you're doing outside of schools in communities, what you're doing with businesses on opportunity, and that you have to have a much broader based holistic approach if you're really going to shift the dial for what, as this committee points out, is decades of challenge that has built up for white working class children in the education system. So there's no silver bullet, but we do need more of those opportunity areas, which are raising education outcomes at a faster rate in opportunity areas than other parts of the country educationally. We need more of those opportunity areas in more of these sorts of communities where we know they can make a big difference.
Justine Greening, we were talking a couple of hours ago to Alan Johnson, like you, a former Education Secretary, like you, grew up in a working class, not particularly privileged background. And he made a lot of the points you made, that actually it's complicated, obviously. You've got, you know, generational worklessness and chaotic households. You've got communities whose local industries have been blighted. You've got a brain drain sometimes away from certain areas, and sometimes a culture that wants for aspiration, educationally, a desire almost not to get on sometimes. But on this very narrow question of white privilege, which seems to be almost a direct import from critical race theory from American campuses, there is a danger, is there not, that if it's pursued too vigorously, we're going to end up targeting resources at communities which relatively speaking, are doing well now. You know, Mercy's from Kenyan heritage, you know, African recent, people who can trace their heritage back to Africa, often very educationally aspirational. There's a danger with this label of white privilege that we completely overlook and forget to give any kind of boosterism to those white working class communities.
I think this is the big challenge, isn't it? Is that you end up with a big debate over the labels and all the focus on that, when what we really need to be asking ourselves is how can we do better for these white working class kids who are in an education system, just as I was years ago, reliant on that system for their first step in life and being able to make the most of their potential. And it's why, certainly from my perspective, when I was running the DFE, I did want to do a policy approach like opportunity areas. And we did put many of them, in fact, virtually all of them were up in those red wall Tory seats. those sorts of communities to really get to grips with how we could, for the long term, places like Stoke, Blackpool, Oldham, Doncaster, Scarborough and the North Yorkshire coast, that's where those opportunity areas are, because that's where we really need to see the change. But actually, a few years on, even though these are long-term pieces of work to tackle long-term challenges, they're already starting to have results and doing better in terms of their improvement than the national average. So I do think we can have a debate around the labels, and I recognise that matters, but fundamentally what parents up and down the country want to know is what's actually going to change to give their kids a better start in school. And we have to recognise, if you want to improve education outcomes in school, it's not enough just to work with teachers and children when they're inside the school gates. We also need to do work outside the school gates to make sure that there's that wider development for these young people as they're growing up.
Do you think where the culture has gone over the last year, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who are saying, well, it's great that we've been talking about things like Black Lives Matter and talking about racial equality and things, but do you think sort of as a result of that, we're not, culturally speaking, we're almost too shy to discuss this issue properly, and to almost, you know, you're saying we need to look at actual solutions and go into this issue deeper than we have been, so we can find where the solutions are. But the kind of discourse around ethnicity at the moment, it doesn't lend itself very well to being able to discuss all the nuances of ethnicity and disadvantage without often people throwing accusations around. We need to have a broader discussion, but the discourse doesn't allow for it.
And I think there is a real danger that it ends up being divisive, when actually what we need to recognise is the things that are holding people back isn't necessarily just ethnicity, it's also your socioeconomic background. It's not just the quality of your local school, which is a big challenge, I think, for a number of white working class communities, but it's also your access to opportunities after education. And so I think wherever you're growing up in the United Kingdom, there are these different challenges. And the reason I had introduced opportunity areas was because when you're out on the ground talking to teachers who are leading schools, different communities do have different problems. So in some communities, it was very much a lack of aspiration. Maybe a lack of high-skilled jobs meant that children were coming into school not really aiming as high as they could do because they couldn't see what those opportunities looked like. In other areas, it was much more around the challenge of children transitioning from primary school into secondary school. Suddenly, their motivations almost, or their progress really dropped off. The key to success is having a place-based approach on education, which is what the Education Select Committee has said, and I agree with that, and making sure that very different communities with very different education challenges get the chance to tailor what happens on education to the challenges that they're facing locally, not just a one-size-fits-all approach from Whitehall. So, for example, on opportunity areas in Scarborough, one of the biggest challenges facing the town was that they had too many teacher vacancies. It was hard to literally get the teachers they needed. That opportunity area decided they would focus on getting the best talent into Scarborough. Last academic year was the first academic year when they started with no teaching roles unfilled. In Doncaster, it was a very different story. In Blackpool, a very different story again, much more focus on secondary schools and the link to jobs and careers afterwards. All of these very different communities had opportunity areas, but took very different approaches. That's why we need more of those opportunity areas, to give more opportunities to the same sorts of communities facing the same challenges.
Sure. Thank you. We have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us this morning.